The first gunshot sounded 3 minutes before the wedding. Lydia Mercer was crouched behind a wall of white roses, adjusting the focus on her second camera, when the crack split the mountaintop silence. Birds burst from the pines beyond the glass chapel. The quartet stopped in the middle of a note. 300 guests in black tie turned toward the eastern terrace, where men disguised as resort security suddenly reached beneath their jackets. Then Gideon Cross raised one hand. The panic died before it could spread. He stood beneath the chapel's stone arch in a black tuxedo, broad shoulders motionless, winter-gray eyes fixed on Lydia instead of the guards. Lydia had photographed powerful men who treated kindness like a defect. None had ever made a crowded room feel so empty. "Where is Celeste?" His voice was quiet. That made it worse. "I don't know." Lydia rose, the camera strap biting into her shoulder. "I finished the dressing photographs 20 minutes ago. She told me to leave." A security officer hurried over and handed Gideon a phone. Lydia caught the message reflected in the chapel glass. "I won't marry a monster." Below it was a photograph of Celeste Vale's engagement ring on a marble counter. Gideon read the message once, then he crushed the phone in his hand. Lock the mountain. The chapel doors slammed shut. Black SUVs rolled across the courtyard and blocked the only road down. Armed men appeared behind pillars, floral arches, and service entrances. The guests began to protest until Gideon looked at them. Celeste's father shoved forward. Conrad Vale was silver-haired, furious, and accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his money. "You cannot imprison 300 people because my daughter lost her nerve." "The first shot came from the East Access Road," Gideon said. "She vanished during the distraction. Until I know whether she ran or was taken, no one leaves." "Do you understand what a canceled wedding will do to both families?" Gideon's face did not change. "Do you?" Conrad stopped talking. Lydia tightened her grip on her camera. She should have been documenting the chaos. That was what she did when people lost control. She found the frame, separated truth from performance, and saved the evidence for later. But Gideon did not look like a rejected groom. He looked like a general whose war had begun on schedule. The wedding planner rushed over, pale beneath perfect makeup. "Mr. Cross, the press helicopter is already circling. We can delay 15 minutes, perhaps 20. "We are not delaying." Conrad stared at him. "You have no bride." Gideon looked at Lydia. Every instinct she had told her to move. She stepped backward. No. He had not spoken yet. He did not need to. Guests parted as he crossed the chapel. Lydia owned a studio, had survived debt and a broken engagement, and had learned not to apologize for her plus-size body. She was not fragile. Still, when Gideon stopped before her, she felt unarmed in a room full of wolves. "How long to alter the spare gown?" he asked. The planner blinked. "For whom?" Gideon kept his eyes on Lydia. "Absolutely not," Lydia said. He extended his hand. She looked at it as if it were a weapon. "I am not marrying you. The ceremony begins in 12 minutes. Then find your actual bride." "I have." A few nearby guests went silent. Lydia gave a breathless laugh. "You don't know me. I know you stayed after Celeste insulted you, because this job will pay for your assistant's father to have heart surgery." Her body went still. Mia had told almost no one. Gideon continued. "I know you photographed a courthouse wedding for free last winter, because the bride had spent her savings leaving an abusive husband. I know you carry protein bars for brides who forget to eat. I know you photograph the cooks, servers, and cleanup crews after every event, because you think no one who works that hard should leave without being remembered." The room tilted around her. "How do you know any of that?" "Put on the dress." "No." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, something more personal. "If this wedding collapses publicly, every organization watching this mountain will read it as weakness," he said. "They will not attack me first." They will attack the guests, the staff, and anyone they think I failed to protect. You expect me to believe marrying a stranger will prevent a war? I expect you to understand that appearances are sometimes the only wall between order and blood. Lydia looked past him at the frightened musicians, servers, cooks, and drivers trapped inside a contest between powerful families. Send them away. The road is compromised. Move them somewhere safe. That is what I am doing. By forcing me into a wedding gown? By giving our enemies the image they were told to expect. Her throat tightened. You can't make me sign a marriage license. His voice dropped. You may refuse, but the doors stay closed, while my men search every room, vehicle, and person on this mountain. That could take hours. The people you are worried about remain exposed until I know who helped Celeste disappear. That is not a choice. No, Gideon said. It isn't. There was no performance between them. He knew exactly what he was doing to her. Lydia hated him for it. She also believed danger was coming. Thunder rolled over the peaks. The planner touched Lydia's arm. The spare gown has a corseted back. We can make it fit. Fit. The word struck hard. Lydia had spent years making herself smaller in other ways, wearing black, hiding behind the lens, laughing at jokes about wide angles. Now hundreds of people would watch her walk down an aisle meant for a woman who had called her body unprofessional. What happens afterward? Lydia asked. You become my wife. Until the danger passes? Gideon did not answer. A second gunshot cracked from the trees, closer than the first. A woman screamed. Weapons came out all around the chapel. Lydia closed her eyes for half a second. Then she placed her camera in Gideon's waiting hand. This does not make me yours. His fingers closed around the worn black grip. The smallest change touched his expression. Not victory, relief. We will discuss that after the vows. The dressing suite became a storm of silk and pins. Seamstresses opened the corset and rebuilt the bodice around Lydia, instead of forcing her into Celeste's shape. In the mirror, she saw auburn hair escaping hurried pins, green eyes bright with fury, and a body that looked powerful beneath ivory silk. The door opened without a knock. Gideon entered, and everyone stopped. His gaze moved over Lydia with such concentrated intensity that the room seemed to lose air. Do you usually invade rooms where women are changing? She asked. No. That almost sounded civilized. I have never been patient where you are concerned. The words were too intimate for strangers. Have we met? Yes. At the St. Vincent Winter Benefit, 22 months ago. She searched her memory. The museum had been full of marble statues and wealthy men donating money to erase guilt. She had photographed hundreds of faces. I don't remember you. I remember you. The certainty frightened her more than the gunfire. A seamstress fastened the last hook. Gideon returned Lydia's camera, but he did not release it when she first reached for it. Once we walk out there, stay beside me. Because of the shooters? Because everyone in that chapel must believe touching you would be fatal. Would it? His thumb brushed her knuckle once. Yes. The chapel doors opened onto a mountain swallowed by storm. Lightning moved behind the glass walls, turning the roses silver. Gideon offered Lydia his arm. She ignored it and walked down the aisle alone. Shock moved through the guests. Security lowered their phones. Conrad Vale looked ready to collapse, and the officiant's hands shook over his book. At the altar, Lydia heard the storm, her own breathing, and the heavy click of the chapel doors locking behind her. When the officiant asked whether she entered the marriage of her own free will, she looked at Gideon. He did not offer reassurance. He did not pretend this was romantic. Beyond him, a young server was crying beside the wall, terrified by the weapons and the shots outside. I do, Lydia said. The words tasted like surrender. Gideon answered without hesitation. The ring intended for Celeste would not pass Lydia's knuckle. Gideon noticed before anyone else. He removed a heavy platinum signet from his own hand and slid it onto hers. It was loose, but he closed her fingers around it. A black cross engraved in the metal pressed into her palm. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Gideon leaned toward her. Lydia put a hand against his chest. No. A murmur moved through the chapel. His heart beat slowly beneath her palm. His eyes dropped to her mouth, then lifted again. I won't kiss a woman who does not ask me to. It was the first mercy he had shown her. He faced the guests instead. My wife and I thank you for witnessing our marriage. My wife. The words moved through the room like distant artillery. Gideon lifted Lydia's hand and kissed her knuckles. The gesture was restrained. The look in his eyes was not. The reception continued because Gideon ordered it. Beneath a glass chandelier, wealthy guests smiled while calculating which alliance had changed. Celeste had not been found. Security recovered shell casings, a blood-stained glove, and tire tracks along a service road. Gideon listened to reports while Lydia's dinner cooled untouched. A blonde woman across the table looked Lydia over and laughed softly. Celeste disappears, and Gideon replaces her with the help. The man beside her was Bryce Caldwell, a real estate billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers. He smiled at Lydia with the confidence of someone who had never paid for cruelty. The photographer, he corrected, though Cross clearly needed someone who could fill the dress on short notice. Lydia reached for her water. She had learned to let insults pass through her without leaving visible damage. Gideon stopped speaking. The men around him fell silent. What did you say? He asked Bryce. Bryce gave a drunken laugh. Nothing worth interrupting business. Gideon rose and walked around the table. He adjusted Bryce's bow tie with almost friendly precision. Apologize to my wife. Bryce laughed again. Gideon hit him once. Bryce collapsed across the table, scattering crystal and silverware. Blood ran from his mouth onto the white floor. Guests screamed. The orchestra stopped. Gideon hauled him upright by the back of his jacket. I asked you to apologize. Bryce made a broken sound. Gideon released him and looked at the blonde woman. Would you like to repeat your comment? She shook her head. Then leave. The doors are locked, she whispered. They will open for you. Security escorted her away. Gideon returned to Lydia, sat down, and wiped blood from his knuckles with a linen napkin. You broke his jaw. He insulted you. People have insulted me before. Not in front of me. That does not make violence acceptable. No, Gideon said. It makes the consequence predictable. She should have felt only disgust. Part of her did. Another part, the tired, wounded part that had smiled through humiliation for years, felt protected. She hated that feeling most. You do not know me well enough to defend me like that. His gaze held hers. I know you better than you think. The chandelier exploded. Glass rained across the ballroom. Gideon seized Lydia around the waist and drove them behind the marble table as bullets tore through the windows. Guests scattered. Security teams rose from hidden positions. The orchestra pit became a barricade. Gideon covered Lydia with his body, one hand protecting the back of her head. Are you hit? I don't know. Look at me. She opened her eyes. His face was inches away. A thin line of blood ran from his temple. The cold control was gone. For the first time, Gideon Cross looked afraid. Not for himself. For her. I'm not hurt, Lydia said. He checked her cheek, throat, and shoulders anyway. Another burst of gunfire ripped through the room. Gideon fired twice over the table. A rifleman appeared through the smoke and turned toward Lydia. Gideon shot first. He did not look at the body. He pressed Lydia's camera into her hands, lifted her into his arms, and carried her through smoke, shattered glass, and overturned tables. Outside, snow spun around black SUVs and gunfire. Gideon carried Lydia toward an armored vehicle, his body between hers and every threat. She saw the frame, blood on his collar, storm over the peaks, her ivory train spilling over his arm. It was the kind of frame that could define a career. It was also the moment she understood that the wedding had not ended the danger. It had placed her at the center of it. They reached Gideon's Chicago penthouse before dawn. Cross Tower's penthouse was dark stone, warm wood, and guarded glass. A doctor stitched Gideon's temple, while Lydia stood in her torn gown. She asked to go home. Gideon said no. She demanded a lawyer. He said one was coming. She tried to call Mia. Gideon's security chief, Anton, informed her that outgoing calls were being monitored until the attackers were identified. The walls were beautiful. The doors were guarded. Luxury did not make a prison less of a prison. When the doctor left, Gideon poured 2 glasses of water. Lydia refused hers. Who attacked the wedding? Mateo Serrano. Who is he? A man who mistakes patience for weakness. That is not an answer. He controls ports, weapons routes, narcotics, and enough political leverage to make investigations disappear. He has spent 5 years trying to take territory from me. And marrying Celeste Vale was supposed to stop him? The Vales control shipping access he needs. So the wedding was business. Initially, that word caught. Why did you choose me? Because you were there. Lydia knew a lie when she saw one. Her career depended on noticing what people concealed. The groom watching an exit. The mother smiling with resentment. The bride tightening her fingers when someone mentioned forever. Gideon's face was controlled. Too controlled. You knew about Mia's father. You remembered me from an event almost 2 years ago. What happened at the St. Vincent benefit? You defended a waitress. Memory returned. Senator Halpern had accused a server of spilling wine on him. Lydia's photographs proved he had knocked the tray from her hand. She had sent the images to the event director, knowing the senator could blacklist her. He was lying, she said. Everyone knew. Then why was I the only person who said anything? That was the question I could not stop asking. Silence stretched between them. You investigated me. I learned about you. Without my knowledge. Yes. For how long? Before he could answer, a woman entered carrying clothes. Not a robe or borrowed sweatpants. An entire wardrobe. Trousers, dresses, sweaters, coats, sleepwear. Everything was Lydia's exact size. She turned toward Gideon. You had these before tonight. The woman froze. Gideon dismissed her. How long? Lydia asked again. 22 months. Her anger turned cold. You have been watching me for 22 months. Watching is an imprecise word. Give me a precise one. Protecting. I did not ask for your protection. No. You knew Celeste would disappear. His jaw tightened. The smallest reaction was enough. You knew. Before he answered, an alarm sounded in the corridor. Anton entered carrying a handheld scanner. We found a transmitter sewn into the bridal train. Gideon looked at Lydia's dress. Take it off. Excuse me? Now. 2 guards stepped forward. Gideon stopped them with one glance and approached Lydia himself. Someone has been tracking you since the mountain. His fingers found a crystal seam near her hip. Lydia went rigid as he tore the fabric open. A red light blinked beneath the lining. Gideon ripped out a device no larger than a coin and crushed it under his heel. The penthouse lights went dark. Gunfire erupted from the roof. He dragged Lydia behind a stone column as muzzle flashes strobed beyond the windows. A helicopter rose beside the neighboring tower, its side door open. They followed us, Lydia whispered. They followed you. A bullet struck the glass. The reinforced window held. Gideon's men rushed toward the upper stairs. He gripped the back of Lydia's neck, firm but careful. There is a safe room behind the library. You go with Anton. I am not going anywhere without answers. Someone is firing armor-piercing rounds at this building. And that is still less frightening than the wardrobe you prepared months before forcing me to marry you. Pain crossed his face before control covered it. "We survived the night," he said. "Then ask anything. Will you tell me the truth?" "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." The helicopter swept closer. Gideon pushed Lydia toward Anton and turned for the stairwell. She caught his wrist. "Where are you going?" "To remove the threat." "You are injured." "I have been injured before." He tried to pull away. Lydia held on. "Come back." The words escaped before she could take them back. Something fierce and vulnerable entered his eyes. He pressed her hand against his chest. "I will come back to you." Then he disappeared into the dark. The helicopter fell into the Chicago River 6 minutes later. By sunrise, the attack was over. Serrano had lost 11 men. Gideon had lost 3. Lydia learned their names because she refused to let anyone speak of them as numbers. Samuel Ortiz had 2 daughters. Peter Novak had been engaged. Daniel Cho had planned to open a restaurant with his brother. She wrote condolence letters at the library desk while Gideon watched from the doorway. A bandage crossed his temple. Bruises darkened his knuckles. "Most people try not to know their names," he said. "Most people are cowards." "Yes." "You agreed too quickly. I have always known what I am." There was no self-pity in the admission. That made it heavier. "You promised answers." Gideon closed the library doors. Celeste was not taken. She left voluntarily. "You helped her." "Yes." "What did you do?" "I gave her $5 million, a new identity, and transportation out of the country." The truth struck like a shove. "You paid your bride to abandon you." "Yes." "Why?" His eyes held hers. "You know why." "No." "Say it." "I saw you at the museum. After that, I hired your studio through third parties. I attended events where you were working. I learned your schedule, the coffee shop you used after morning shoots, and the route you took home at night." "That is stalking." "Yes." The bluntness stole her next response. "You were engaged to Celeste." "It was an arrangement. She wanted my name and protection for her family. I wanted the Vale shipping network. And then I wanted you." The fire cracked behind Lydia. "You could have spoken to me." "I intended to." "When?" "When I was certain you could not disappear." Her stomach turned. "So you trapped me." "I created circumstances that would keep you close long enough to understand what I could offer." "You locked 300 people inside a chapel. You used a cartel threat to force me to the altar." "The threat was real. Because Serrano expected you to marry Celeste. He would have attacked any woman beside me." "And you chose to put me there." Gideon's jaw hardened. "Yes." Lydia crossed the room and slapped him. The sound echoed between the shelves. His head turned with the force of it. He did not raise a hand. He did not touch his cheek. "Do it again," he said. "You do not get to make this easier by accepting punishment. I am not trying to make it easier. You manipulated everything." "Not everything." "Which part was real?" His control fractured. "The part where I could not breathe when that rifle turned toward you. The part where I would have torn the mountain apart to reach you. The part where the thought of someone hurting you became the only fear I could not eliminate." "That is not love." "No." His voice lowered. "It is worse." He approached but stopped before touching her. "I do not know how to want something gently. I know how to acquire territory, remove enemies, and build walls no one can cross." Then I saw you tell the truth in a room where everyone else had decided a waitress was expendable. You were kind without being weak. You looked through a camera and found people the powerful preferred to erase. So you lied to me. Yes. You forced me. Yes. And you expect me to stay because you bought clothes and broke a man's jaw. No. What do you expect? That you will see me clearly and decide for yourself. The answer was not enough. It was more honest than she expected. "The marriage is legal," Gideon added. but I have instructed my attorneys not to contest an annulment. You will let me leave? Pain crossed his face. If you still want to leave when Serrano is no longer a threat, every door will open. And until then, I keep you alive. Lydia went to the library door. It opened before she touched it. Gideon had not locked it. That should not have mattered. It did. For 6 days, Lydia lived inside his fortress. She refused the diamonds, chose a distant guest suite, and made Gideon promise the staff would eat the same meals served to them. He accepted each boundary without argument. He was still everywhere. At breakfast, he read intelligence reports, while she recovered wedding photographs. In elevators and cars, he placed himself between her and every possible threat. At night, he stood alone on the rooftop. He did not touch her. That became its own kind of tension. Sometimes his hand stopped inches from her back. Sometimes she caught desire in his eyes before he turned away. Twice, she woke from gunfire dreams and found him outside her room. He never entered. He never admitted he had been waiting. On the 7th night, Lydia followed him into the elevator. I need to go to my studio. No. You said the doors were open. I said they would open when Serrano was dead. Mia has been running my business alone. Mia is protected. She needs me. So do I. The words escaped before Gideon could stop them. Lydia studied his reflection in the mirrored wall. That sounded almost human. It was a tactical error. The elevator reached the garage. A convoy waited beneath fluorescent lights. Gideon handed Lydia a bullet-resistant coat. I am coming with you. I assumed the army was decorative. You joke when you are afraid. You become unbearable when you are afraid. His eyes met hers. I am always afraid where you are concerned. He said it without drama. That was why she believed him. Rain covered the city as the convoy moved toward Lydia's studio. Gideon sat close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. His men secured the block. Lydia entered first. The studio looked untouched. Camera cases lined one wall. Framed photographs covered the exposed brick. Brides laughing in rain. Elderly couples dancing. Children sleeping beneath reception tables. Then she saw a red light above the editing station. A hidden camera. Her pulse slowed because anger had become cold enough to sharpen everything. She climbed onto a chair and tore the device from the ceiling. Gideon entered as it struck the floor. Yours? His silence answered. How many? Lydia. How many cameras? 3. She found one behind a framed print and another inside the smoke detector near the darkroom. You watched me here. Only security accessed the feeds. That is supposed to help? No. She threw the camera at him. He caught it. Get out. His guards looked toward him. Gideon raised one hand, and they left. He remained. I said get out. I cannot protect you from the hallway. You lost the right to call this protection. The cameras were installed after a man followed you home from a wedding in Evanston. Lydia remembered the dark sedan appearing twice in her rearview mirror. She had convinced herself she was imagining it. What happened to him? He no longer follows women. The answer chilled her. You decide everything, when it concerns your safety. My safety belongs to me, not while men are trying to kill you. And afterward, he looked at the broken camera in his hand. Afterward, I will try to remember that keeping you is not the same as earning you. The admission reached somewhere she did not want him to reach. The studio windows shattered. Gideon crossed the room and threw Lydia behind the editing desk. A metal cylinder rolled across the floor. Close your eyes. White light exploded. The flash grenade turned the studio into a ringing void. Hands dragged Lydia across the floor. She kicked, twisted, and bit down on someone's wrist. A man cursed. Through blurred vision, she saw Gideon fighting near the broken window. Then a needle entered her neck. The last thing she saw was Gideon turning toward her. His face was not cold. It was terrified. Lydia woke beneath a broken stained glass window. Rain tapped the roof of an abandoned church. Her wrists were tied to a wooden chair where the altar had once stood. Her camera lay on the floor in front of her. A man in a charcoal suit waited beneath the ruined cross. Mateo Serrano was younger than she expected, elegant and calm, with eyes that held no warmth. "You caused quite a transformation," he said. "I get that a lot at weddings." He smiled. "Gideon said you joke when you are afraid." Cold moved through her. "You have spoken to him. I have studied him for 15 years. Until you, Gideon Cross had no weakness. He had habits, preferences, strategic dependencies, but no weakness. And now you think I am one." "I know you are." Serrano lifted Lydia's camera and scrolled through the images. The shattered chandelier, guests hiding under tables, Gideon carrying her through the snow. "You captured him beautifully, even covered in blood. He looks like a king." "He looks like a man trying to keep people alive. Is that what he told you?" Serrano placed a folder in her lap. It contained bank transfers from a cross-controlled account to Celeste Vale. $5 million, paid 6 weeks before the wedding. "Gideon told me he paid her." "Did he tell you when?" Serrano added photographs. Lydia leaving her apartment. Lydia working beside the lake. Lydia alone in a coffee shop. Lydia asleep on a train with her camera bag against her chest. Hundreds of images, nearly 2 years of her life. "He chose Black Glass Lodge because you once called it the most beautiful place you had ever worked," Serrano said. "He chose the date because your schedule was open. He had the planner hire your studio. He commissioned a second gown with an adjustable corset." Lydia stared at him. The spare gown had never belonged to Celeste. It had been made for her. "The flowers, the dress, the disappearing bride," Serrano said. "Every detail was designed to place you at the altar. Celeste was not the bride, she was bait." Pain opened inside Lydia, quiet and deep. "The first gunshot," she said. "Was that Gideon?" Serrano smiled. "A controlled distraction. My men fired the second. The entire opening had been choreographed. Gideon had created the panic that cornered her into saying yes." Serrano crouched in front of her. "Cross did not fall in love with you, Lydia. He collected you." The church doors exploded inward. Gideon walked through smoke and gunfire, blood spreading across his black shirt. 6 men followed, but Lydia saw only his face. He had seen the papers at her feet. "She knows," Serrano said. Gideon's expression emptied. "Let her go." Serrano dragged Lydia upright by her hair and pressed a pistol beneath her jaw. Every weapon in the church remained raised. "You built an empire on fear," Serrano said. "Then a woman with a camera made you sentimental." Gideon lowered his gun. "Take the ports," he said. "Take the Vale routes, the council seats, the companies that hide the money. Take all of it." Lydia stared at him. Gideon had spent half his life building power no rival could penetrate. Now he surrendered it without negotiation. "And what do you want?" Serrano asked. "My wife. Even after she knows what you did. Especially then." "Why?" Gideon looked only at Lydia. "Because she will leave me." There it was, not fear of death, certainty of loss. "She should," Serrano said. "Yes." Lydia's anger remained, but she noticed Gideon's left hand near his thigh. 2 fingers tapped 3 times, paused, then tapped again. A signal. Her camera was on the floor with the flash attached. She moved 1 foot toward it. Serrano tightened his grip. "Don't." "Lydia, look at me," Gideon said. She did. "I am sorry." No defense, no attempt to make his obsession sound noble. "I know. Apology is too small. Wanting, you did not give me the right to arrange your life. Protecting you did not give me the right to take your choices." Serrano laughed, touching. Gideon ignored him. You asked which part was real. The fear was real. The need was real. And this is real. I would burn everything I built if it bought you one more day. Lydia's shoe reached the camera. You do not love gently, she whispered. No. Then learn. She kicked the camera upward. The flash fired. White light filled the church. Lydia drove her head into Serrano's face and dropped. Gideon fired, striking his shoulder. Lydia crawled behind the altar and used the camera to bring down a guard. Across the church, Gideon fought toward Serrano, stepped on his reaching hand, and drove him against the stone. This ends tonight. She will never forgive you, Serrano said through blood. Gideon looked at Lydia. She may not. He raised his gun. Gideon. He stopped. Lydia saw the choice in his eyes. Killing Serrano was the language he knew. Dead enemies never returned. Mercy had never kept him alive. Do not do it for me. Serrano smiled and reached for a second pistol hidden at his ankle. Lydia saw it first. She lifted her camera and pressed the shutter. The click turned Gideon's head. He fired once. Serrano collapsed beneath the broken cross. When the ropes were cut from Lydia's wrists, Gideon did not touch her. He stood several feet away, bleeding through his shirt, and waited. I will take you anywhere you want to go, he said. You need a hospital. Yes. You will actually go? If you come with me, she nearly agreed. Then she looked at the scattered photographs, the stolen years, the wedding built around her without permission. No. The word struck him harder than the bullet. I will make sure your men take you, but I am not going home with you. Gideon was silent. Then he nodded. All right. No command. No threat. I want every camera removed from my studio and apartment, Lydia said. I want every surveillance file destroyed. I want Mia, and I want annulment papers. Each demand cost him. He accepted all of them. You will have the papers tomorrow. He walked away before she could see him break. 3 weeks passed. Wedding videos leaked. Commentators accused Lydia of stealing another woman's future and mocked her body. Clients canceled. Someone painted thief across her studio windows. Gideon stayed away and kept every promise. The cameras vanished. Lydia watched the surveillance archive destroyed. Signed annulment papers arrived with a handwritten note. No excuses, no conditions. The choice is yours now. She should have felt free. Instead, his absence followed her through every long night at the studio. Mia found her among the canceled contracts. You miss him. I miss who he might become. He forced you into marriage and watched you for 2 years. I know. But he let you leave. That should not be the standard. No, Mia said. It may be the first honest thing he has done. Before Lydia could answer, every screen in the studio came alive. Gideon stood at a podium outside Cross Tower. Federal agents carried boxes through the lobby behind him. Reporters crowded the street. Celeste Vale did not abandon our wedding without assistance, he said. I paid her to leave. I arranged the circumstances that placed Lydia Mercer at the altar. She had no knowledge of the plan. A reporter shouted, Did you force her to marry you? Yes. The direct answer silenced them. I used danger I helped create to limit her choices. I believed my desire to protect her excused my methods. It did not. It did not. Every accusation directed at Lydia belongs to me. He announced that control of his legitimate holdings had been transferred to an independent trust. Evidence against the Vale and Serrano organizations had gone to federal authorities. And your organization? Someone called. Mine as well. Chaos erupted. Lydia understood what he was doing. Gideon had built power so no one could take anything from him. Now he was dismantling it because it was the only proof he knew how to give that he had stopped trying to own her. Do you expect to be prosecuted? Yes. Why confess now? Gideon looked into the central camera. Because my wife taught me that love without choice is another form of captivity. Lydia was already reaching for her coat. Rain covered Chicago when Lydia reached Cross Tower. Reporters surrounded her beneath the glass canopy, shouting about annulment, threats, and whether she remained Gideon's wife. For years she had hidden behind a camera. Now every lens pointed at her. My marriage is none of your business. The penthouse was empty. Guards and staff were gone. Cardboard boxes lined the walls. She found Gideon on the rooftop terrace, rain soaking his black shirt. You should not be here, he said. I am beginning to think you say that when you desperately want me somewhere. Hope transformed his face for one unguarded second. Then he forced it away. The building may be seized tonight. There will be trials, restrictions, and enemies who survived Serrano. You should sign the annulment. You spent 2 years arranging a marriage, and now you want me to end it? I arranged a prison and called it protection. You also signed the papers that opened the door. I should have given you the choice before the altar. Yes. I should have spoken to you at the museum. Yes. I should never have watched you without consent. Definitely. He looked almost uncertain. It was the most powerful she had ever seen him. I do not know what happens now. Lydia removed the annulment papers from her coat. I signed my section this morning. Something died in his expression. Then she tore the papers in half. This does not erase what you did. It does not mean I belong to you. You do not make decisions about my body, work, safety, or life without me. If I ever find another hidden camera, I will throw you off this roof. The faintest breath of laughter escaped him. Understood. I am not staying because you trapped me. I am staying because when you finally opened the door, I wanted to know who you might become outside the cage you built around yourself. Lydia. But I need the truth. Why me? Gideon lifted a hand, then stopped before touching her. He waited. Lydia leaned into his palm. At the St. Vincent benefit, he said, everyone was afraid of Senator Halpern. You were afraid too, but you told the truth anyway. You photographed the waitress afterward, when she had lifted her head again. You made her look powerful. He moved his thumb across Lydia's cheek. Then I noticed every photograph of you placed you at the edge, half hidden, cut from the frame. I was working. You were disappearing. I wanted to see you. I thought if I built the perfect circumstance, you would feel what I felt. You built a nightmare. Yes. The dress was made for me. Yes. The mountain? The roses? Every detail. You are terrifying. Yes. And obsessive. Yes. And still technically my husband. Gideon looked afraid to answer. Yes. Lydia placed his hand at her waist. His fingers spread over her curves, not claiming, waiting. Tell me what you want, he said. It was the question he should have asked at the beginning. I want you to kiss me. He did, but he followed every change in her. When she slowed, he slowed. When she pulled him closer, he came closer. Nothing between them existed without her choice. When they separated, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. I will fail at this. I am sure. I will become controlling. I will stop you. I will want to lock every door. Then I will take the hinges off. And if I become afraid, tell me. I do not know how. Learn. I love you, he said. The confession sounded like surrender. Lydia touched the scar through his eyebrow. I am not ready to say it yet. I know. But I came back. His eyes closed. For Gideon Cross, that was enough. 6 months later, Lydia returned to Black Glass Lodge. The gates were gone. The rebuilt ballroom had become an art center for creators who could not afford industry access. Gideon had transferred the property to Lydia before his first court hearing, and she had turned his trap into a place where other people could become visible. Snow covered the peaks. White roses lined the chapel. This time, the doors stood open. Gideon waited beneath the arch. His empire was gone. His remaining businesses were independently supervised, and his cooperation agreement required restitution and years of restrictions. He was still dangerous. He carried it differently. Lydia walked down the aisle alone, wearing a deep ivory gown designed for her body from the first sketch. A camera hung from her wrist. At the altar, Gideon glanced toward the open doors. "Are you certain?" The guests heard him. "That was intentional." "No locked doors?" Lydia asked. "Never again." "No secret contracts?" "No." "No replacement brides?" His mouth almost curved. "There has only ever been one." Their first ceremony had been a declaration of power. The second was a confession. Gideon promised to ask instead of command. Lydia promised honesty, including the kind that hurt. She promised to stay only while staying remained her choice. He produced the same platinum signet ring, now resized. Inside, beneath the black cross, Lydia had engraved 3 words: "The door is open." His composure nearly failed. "Do you, Lydia Mercer, choose this man as your husband?" She looked into the winter-gray eyes of the man who had once arranged an entire wedding because he could not risk rejection. Now he stood before her with nothing hidden and every exit visible. "Yes," Lydia said, "I choose him." When the officiant invited Gideon to kiss the bride, he waited. Lydia smiled, took his face in her hands, and kissed him first. Later, snow gathered on the terrace while music filled the lodge. Lydia raised her camera. "I do not like being photographed. That is why I am doing it." Through the viewfinder, she saw the man who had built a trap from roses and vows, then destroyed his empire rather than keep her inside it. "Smile," she said. "No, for your wife." His expression changed only slightly. Lydia caught it. The shutter clicked. Gideon crossed the terrace, set the camera safely on a table, and lifted her into his arms. "Where are you taking me?" "Inside. You cannot command the weather, so now you are commanding me? I am carrying my wife away from a storm. I happen to like storms." His gaze lowered to her mouth. "So do I." Behind them, the chapel doors glowed with candlelight. Ahead, music and laughter filled the lodge. Gideon carried her toward both, and this time, Lydia went willingly.